If you'd met me 2 years ago, you probably wouldn't have looked twice. I blended into the background of boardrooms and office kitchens with the kind of polished discretion only women like me master. Not too loud, not too quiet. Pretty, but not threateningly so. I kept my nails clean, wore neutral tones, and smiled when spoken to. My name is Sandy. I've been a secretary at Elleron Holdings for 8 years. And last Monday, I made a choice that changed everything. Before I get to the part where I bought the rights to a $70 million asset for $1, let me tell you what kind of woman I used to be. The kind men like Pedro Beltran, our CEO, thought they could laugh at in front of a boardroom full of executives. Every day, I arrive 15 minutes early. I sit at the long oak desk outside Pedro's office and listen. Not intentionally, but when people talk around you like you're furniture, you start to pick up the pieces. Over the years, I learned more about the company from overheard phone calls and discarded drafts than from any official training. I knew who was sleeping with whom, who was planning to resign, and who was cooking the quarterly numbers to please the board. I never said a word. That's what made me invaluable and invisible. But I wasn't always invisible to everyone. There's a woman named Rachel in compliance, short, sharp-eyed, always eating almonds during meetings. She noticed. She started handing me contracts to prep, saying, "Sandy, can you double-check the asset appendices?" As if she didn't trust her own team. I caught things no one else did. Typos, duplications, and once, an entire missing clause. Rachel never said thank you, but she always sent me new files. That was our language. Still, for everyone else, I was just Sandy, the secretary with the neat bun and the quiet smile. Then came the acquisition deal. From the moment Pedro first mentioned it in the hallway, waving around the name of a struggling biotech firm he planned to rescue with Elleron's capital, I knew it was big. $70 million big. It would be the largest acquisition in the company's history. The type of deal that would secure Pedro's legacy and probably earn him a glossy magazine cover. And the responsibility for prepping the purchase documents? That fell on me. Not because anyone believed I was brilliant. It was because I was the one who always got things done. Jackson, our company lawyer, was too busy chasing tax loopholes in Monaco to draft contracts from scratch, and Pedro's executive assistant had conveniently gone on stress leave the day after the deal was announced. So, it was me. I printed drafts, organized appendices, created the signature packets, and sat in the conference room late into the night, making sure every copy was pristine. I didn't mind. There's something calming about order, about knowing exactly what's in a 170-page document and where every line leads. That's how I spotted it. It was buried on page 42, clause 7.2. Something about pre-transfer asset allocation. The language was vague, almost too vague, the kind of vague that feels intentional. I reread it 4 times, then cross-referenced it with the original merger guidelines. My stomach turned. The clause allowed for internal reassignment of intellectual property before the acquisition was finalized. In plain language, it meant that anyone with internal access, anyone at Elleron, could technically transfer rights to certain assets before the deal closed, and the acquiring company would have no claim on them afterward. The clause didn't include a lockout period or post-signature enforcement. It was a loophole, a serious one. I printed the page and highlighted it in yellow. Then I did something I hadn't done in 8 years. I spoke up. It was during the final acquisition meeting. We were in the main conference room, the big one with floor-to-ceiling windows and the glass table that cost more than my car. Everyone was there. Pedro, Jackson, board member Elaine Dawes, 2 other senior VPs I barely knew, and me, sitting quietly in the corner, with my laptop and a paperclip folder of everything they were about to sign. Pedro was in full performance mode, pacing as he talked about strategic integration and unlocking synergies. Jackson nodded occasionally, pretending to listen, while Elaine scrolled on her phone. I waited for a break in the noise. Then I stood. "Excuse me," I said. My voice sounded smaller than I wanted it to. I noticed something in Clause 7.2. I think there might be a— Pedro turned so fast I flinched. A what, Sandy? I swallowed. A loophole. In the asset reassignment language. It might allow internal transfers before the— He raised his hand and laughed. Actually laughed. The kind of dry, performative chuckle that men like him have rehearsed in front of mirrors. Oh, Sandy, he said, shaking his head, his voice loud enough to echo. You're just a simple, dim-witted secretary, not a lawyer. Don't pretend to think like one. The room went quiet. Then, slowly, Jackson smirked. Elaine looked up briefly, then went back to scrolling. One of the VPs snorted under his breath. I felt my face burn. I sat down. But something inside me didn't sit, because Pedro hadn't even read the contract. I knew that. I'd watched him skim it once while eating a sandwich. He didn't know what Clause 7.2 said. And Jackson? He probably thought due diligence was the name of his new intern. They weren't being smart. They were being arrogant. And arrogance is dangerous when it forgets who's watching. I didn't go home that night. I stayed in the office long after the others had left. I made tea in the break room. I reread the contract for the 6th time. And I thought, this wasn't just about Pedro mocking me. This was about carelessness. About a man willing to gamble $70 million on a deal he didn't understand. About a lawyer too lazy to check for holes. About a company that trusted faces in suits over minds behind desks. And then I remembered. The clause didn't just allow for asset reassignment. It allowed for asset purchase. I opened a private browser on my laptop and searched the asset registry for the biotech firm. I found a small patent they held, one that wasn't even mentioned in the main valuation packet. A minor algorithm related to gene mapping. I recognized it because I'd prepared a summary of it weeks earlier. No one had paid it much attention, but it was valuable. Very valuable. And because of the clause, it was technically separable from the acquisition. The registry said it could be purchased independently as long as there was no legal block. I double-checked. There wasn't. So I called a friend. Brian. Works in contract management at a boutique law firm. We met once at Rachel's birthday dinner, and he'd always said, "If you ever need a favor, call me. I like smart women who don't talk much." I told him what I wanted. "Are you serious?" he asked. "Very," I said. 2 hours later, I had a shell company name, a purchase agreement, and a notarized transfer document for the algorithm. The total cost? $1. A real, physical dollar. I taped it to the inside of the file just to make it official. The next morning, I emailed the biotech firm's administrator, using the shell company's email. I offered to buy the isolated patent. They accepted. I wired the dollar from my savings account and signed the agreement. 30 minutes later, I received the official confirmation. That algorithm was mine. Not Eleron's, not Pedro's, mine. And they didn't even notice. At least, not until 3 weeks later, when the final acquisition paperwork went through, and the purchasing company, the one that had paid $70 million, asked politely, "Where's the gene mapping patent listed in your valuation?" That's when Pedro called Jackson into a closed-door meeting. That's when Elaine stopped scrolling her phone and started making calls. That's when people started looking through the contracts again. And that's when someone finally said the words I'd been waiting to hear. Wait, where did Clause 7.2 come from? The office was quiet by the time I turned off the overhead lights. It always was after hours. Just the low hum of the vending machine down the hall and the occasional ping from the old elevator shaft, like the building itself was sighing in its sleep. Everyone had gone home. Pedro had taken his usual dramatic exit around 5, tossing his suit jacket over one shoulder, like a man walking off a movie set. Jackson had lingered long enough to make a show of sending a few late emails, then disappeared, probably to another overpriced dinner he'd write off as client relations. Even the cleaning crew wasn't due for another hour. I sat alone in conference room B, the contract sprawled out before me, like a map to buried treasure. I didn't know why my hands were trembling. Maybe because I had never crossed a line before. Not like this. Not deliberately. I had spent years being useful, quiet, dependable. I fixed printer jams. I fetched coffee when no one asked me to. I double-checked travel itineraries and stayed late to resend things other people forgot. And in return, I was overlooked. Politely, consistently, sometimes cruelly. But never like that day in the conference room. Never laughed at, not to my face. That laugh had lodged itself under my skin like a splinter. And now I was holding the weapon that laugh had handed me, Clause 9.3c, titled, Dormant Asset Transfer and Licensing Rights. It sounded dull. It looked unimportant, sandwiched between legal definitions and indemnity language. But if you read carefully, and I had, it granted any internal party the right to assume dormant intellectual property licenses held under provisional classification if no objection was filed by the board of directors within 14 days of transfer. The condition was wrapped in so much technical jargon that most people would have missed it. But I didn't. Because I'm the one who prints these contracts. I'm the one who staples the annexes. I'm the one who reads the details no one else does. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the clause like it had just blinked at me. There it was, plain as daylight. The gene mapping algorithm, still registered under dormant status in the asset inventory, was eligible for independent licensing. And the process? All it required was a notarized transfer application, a formal filing to the registrar's office, and a symbolic payment of at least $1 to satisfy contractual consideration. A single dollar, for the key to a $70 million deal. I laughed then, not loud, not bitter, just a single breath of disbelief. Not because the loophole existed. I'd known that the night before, but because of how easy it was, how utterly simple it had been to build a system so bloated, so carelessly managed, that someone like me could walk in and pluck the golden thread right from its center. I reread the clause 3 more times, then went to work. I used my personal laptop, not the company's. I filled out the provisional license request using the shell entity Brian had helped me create the night before. Standard procedure for independent applications. I double-checked every field, every date, every signature line. Then I printed 2 copies, slid them into a blank envelope, and placed a single dollar bill inside. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on my couch staring at the ceiling fan, feeling the buzz of something electric in my bones. Not fear, not yet, but the cold realization that I had stepped off the edge of something. The fall hadn't started, but the step was taken. The next morning, I wore navy blue. Not because it was special, but because it made me look steady. I packed the documents in my tote bag, skipped the bus, and walked 15 blocks to a notary's office I'd researched the night before. It was a small, dusty place above a strip of insurance offices. A woman in her 60s greeted me with a polite nod and offered me a seat. "This form looks familiar," she said, adjusting her glasses. "Corporate licensing?" "Yes," I said, my voice even. "Internal transfer." She nodded, stamped the pages, and slid the documents back to me. "Payment?" I pulled the dollar from the envelope and placed it on the desk. Her eyebrows lifted. "That's it?" "That's all it takes," I said quietly. She didn't ask more questions, just placed the dollar in her drawer and handed me the finalized copy. I left the office with shaking hands. Not from nerves, from certainty. It was done. Filed. Official. Legal. I had executed a dormant license acquisition through a publicly available clause in the contract Pedro had never bothered to read. And no one could stop me. Not unless the board of directors formally objected in writing. But they wouldn't, because they didn't even know what Clause 9.3c was. Most of them hadn't even seen the full draft. The vote had been fast, smug, unanimous. The real work had been done by people like me, and forgotten. Back at the office, everything looked the same. The receptionist smiled as I walked past. Jackson waved lazily from the coffee machine. Pedro barked at someone over a Zoom call, still riding high on his upcoming acquisition announcement. No one noticed the envelope in my bag. No one noticed me. But I noticed everything. I sat down at my desk, opened my email, and began typing the weekly prep memo as if nothing had changed. I confirmed the catering order for Friday's investor luncheon. I updated the parking list for visiting executives. I filed digital copies of travel receipts for Pedro's upcoming Madrid trip. Routine, mindless things. But beneath the surface, everything had shifted. The asset. The asset was mine. They didn't know it yet. But they would. I didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. What I felt was stillness. A strange calm. The kind that settles over you when you realize that you no longer need to fight for recognition. You already have something they can't take back. Power, in its purest form, isn't loud. It's silent. And I had it. Not because I was ruthless, but because I was careful. Because while Pedro laughed, I listened. While Jackson ignored, I documented. While the rest of them clinked champagne glasses and quoted quarterly reports, I read the fine print. That evening, as I turned off my monitor and collected my things, I felt it again. That quiet certainty. Like a fuse had been lit in the middle of an empty room, and all I had to do now was wait. And when the explosion came, no one would even remember that it started with a secretary and a single dollar bill. 3 days passed before anything changed. On the surface, everything remained polished and serene. Pedro's espresso still steamed at exactly 9:12 a.m. Jackson still wandered the hallways with his lazy smirk, and the executive boardroom still glowed with the soft hum of power meetings behind frosted glass. But under it all, I could feel something new. Tension. Tight. Trembling at the seams. It began subtly. An email sent at 7:03 a.m. from the legal department, marked urgent, pinged in my inbox by mistake. I wasn't copied on it. My name had been accidentally included in a forwarded chain from one of the paralegals I sometimes helped with formatting. The subject line was simple: dormant license claim. Action required immediately. I read it once, then again. The name of the applicant was redacted in the body of the message, but the panic in the language was unmistakable. Unverified internal claim on licensed asset IP number A47-B. Urgent review needed. Potential breach of acquisition integrity. Assess exposure risk in pending M&A contract. A quiet thrill ran down my spine. They had found it. The dormant clause. The dollar. The ownership transfer. They just didn't know who had done it. By noon, whispers had reached the corners of the office. The head of legal, an uptight man named Arthur, with a permanent scowl, stormed into Pedro's office, slamming the door behind him. 20 minutes later, the CFO joined them. Another 15, and Jackson went in, too, this time without his usual smirk. The glass wall of Pedro's office revealed only silhouettes, pacing and sharp hand gestures, and one frantic moment when Arthur threw his arms into the air like a drowning man waving for rescue. I sat at my desk outside, typing up meeting minutes for a call that had already ended, my eyes flicking occasionally to the glass. Pedro's figure was tense, his shoulders stiff. At one point, he pulled at the collar of his shirt and barked something that made Arthur lean against the wall as if his knees had gone soft. But not once did he look at me. That was when I knew. He suspected, but he didn't want to believe it, because to believe it meant admitting that the woman who had once fetched his coffee, who had been laughed at in front of his executives, who had been labeled dim-witted with a smirk and a wave of dismissal, that this same woman had outmaneuvered him, quietly, legally, and with nothing more than a contract clause and a single dollar. He wouldn't say my name, not yet, but the way his jaw clenched when he walked past me that afternoon, that was acknowledgement, not in words, in fear. By Friday, the panic had spread. 3 separate calls came in from the acquiring firm's legal team demanding clarity. They wanted assurances that all intellectual property listed in the merger valuation was intact and unencumbered. They wanted documentation, guarantees. Pedro couldn't give them any, not without lying. And lying wasn't something you could mask in a $70 million transaction. Not with audits. Not with cross-examinations. Not with due diligence lawyers poring over every comma. That's when I saw it happen. The crack in Pedro's confidence. He came out of a call, face pale, hands trembling just enough to betray him, and barked at the receptionist for an espresso he didn't drink. He stood in front of my desk, flicking through a folder, pretending to be calm, but he couldn't meet my eyes. "Resend the acquisition summary to legal," he said flatly. I nodded. "Already done?" He paused, just long enough that I knew he wanted to ask. I kept my expression still, hands folded gently over the keyboard. I watched him hesitate, just for a breath, before he turned and walked away. That hesitation? That was the shift. He no longer saw me as harmless, and I no longer needed to hide. But I knew better than to celebrate. Because men like Pedro don't give up. They erase obstacles. They destroy them quietly, with rumors, with targeted pressure, with precision. And now? I was an obstacle. That night, I stayed late again. Not because I had work to do, but because I needed to think, to prepare. I knew Pedro would come for me, not directly, not publicly, but in the ways that hurt most. Whispers to HR, questions about my performance, invented infractions, a sudden restructuring, a quiet reassignment to some forgotten department in the basement. I'd seen him do it before. What he didn't know was that I had been watching for years. Not just him, the entire structure. I knew how power moved here. I knew how reputations were dismantled. And I had already started taking precautions, encrypted backups, independent legal advice, a timeline of everything I had done, each step documented, time-stamped, and saved in a cloud he couldn't touch. And something else. Witnesses. People like Rachel, the quiet force in compliance, who had once whispered, "Don't trust them to protect you." People like Brian, who had helped me form the shell company and file the license. People who didn't owe Pedro anything. I didn't know exactly when the retaliation would come, but it would. And when it did, I would be ready. Because he hadn't just underestimated me. He had awakened me, and I was done being quiet. It happened late in the day, right when the office felt most brittle, quiet enough to hear your own thoughts, tense enough to know you weren't the only one having them. Pedro's assistant didn't say anything. She just walked up to my desk, placed a small folded note near my keyboard, and walked away without eye contact. As if even delivering the message made her nervous. In his handwriting, sharp, all caps, rushed, it read, "Conference Room C, 6 p.m., alone." Not please, not even my name. Just a command written like a trap. I didn't hesitate. I saved my work, powered down my screen, and picked up my notebook. I wasn't afraid. I had expected this moment since the day I filed the paperwork. He was waiting inside the glass-walled conference room, sleeves rolled up, jacket draped over the back of a chair. The lights were dimmed just slightly, a performative intimacy. A few thick folders sat open on the table beside a bottle of untouched sparkling water. He didn't look up when I walked in. "Close the door," he said. I did. "Sit." I remained standing. He finally looked up, and there it was again. That thing in his eyes. Not control, not even anger. It was uncertainty. He didn't know what I was going to do next. And for a man like Pedro, that was unbearable. "You've made quite a mess," he said slowly, tapping a pen against the folder's edge. "You're not as quiet as I thought." I said nothing. He leaned back in the chair. "Let's cut through the drama, Sandy." "You filed a claim." "Fine. You saw a loophole. Impressive, I'll admit. Now, tell me what you want to walk away." The silence hung for a beat. "You think I did this for money?" I asked, finally sitting down. Pedro tilted his head. "Everyone does things for money. You don't need to pretend you're above it. Look." He flipped open one of the folders and slid a printed check across the table. 50,000, today, no strings. You sign a transfer agreement, and we close this little hiccup before it becomes a problem." I looked down at the check, then back at him, and smiled. 50,000? I asked calmly. That's what my silence is worth to you? It's more than fair, he snapped, some of that CEO confidence cracking around the edges. You're a secretary. You make what, 40 a year? This is more than a year's salary for pressing a few buttons. I didn't flinch. That's where you're wrong, Pedro, I said softly. I didn't press a few buttons. I read your contracts. I caught the hole you didn't see. And I followed the exact rules your own legal team wrote. You don't understand the stakes. I understand them better than you, I cut in. That startled him. He wasn't used to being interrupted, especially not by someone like me. His mouth tightened, his eyes narrowed. I leaned forward. You laughed at me, I said, in front of a room full of people, not because I was wrong, but because you couldn't imagine that someone like me could be right, that I might actually know something you don't. Pedro didn't speak. You didn't just dismiss my warning. You dismissed me. And that's what this is really about. He reached for the check again. So what, you want more? 100? 2 question mark? I almost laughed. I don't want your money, Pedro. He froze. Ugh, I want you to know that every time you speak now, you have to wonder what I know. Every time you walk into a boardroom, you have to remember that the person you thought was beneath you was the one holding the thread that could unravel your whole performance. I stood, slowly. I know the rules now, I said. The real ones. The ones men like you write in small print and assume no one reads. Pedro's mouth opened slightly, as if to protest, but I saw it in his posture. He wasn't angry anymore. He was afraid. I took one last look at the check still sitting between us and pushed it gently back toward him. Keep it, I said. You'll need it for legal fees. Then I walked out, leaving the door wide open behind me. The HR email arrived at 8:42 p.m. I was still at my desk, pretending to wrap up the day's work while waiting for Pedro to make his final exit. He had a habit of doing late, dramatic strolls through the office when he was rattled. That evening, his steps had been too quick, too clipped, and his briefcase had been slammed rather than closed. I knew the conversation in Conference Room C had left a mark, but I hadn't expected them to move this fast. Subject: Internal review, confidential. The body of the email was coldly professional. Dear Ms. Sanderson, this communication serves as formal notification of an internal review pertaining to potential unauthorized interaction with company confidential documentation related to the pending acquisition. Effective immediately, the Human Resources and Legal Departments will initiate a procedural audit. You are instructed to refrain from accessing further deal-related documentation and to direct any inquiries to the compliance liaison assigned to this review. Please prepare to make yourself available for initial questioning within the next 24 hours. Your cooperation is appreciated. Regards, Lyle Tompkins, Director of Human Resources. I sat back in my chair. The words weren't surprising. They were, in fact, almost comforting in how textbook they were. This was the exact play Pedro would make, not to directly accuse me of wrongdoing, because there wasn't any, but to drape me in just enough suspicion to justify procedure, to isolate me, corner me, strip away whatever credibility I had left in the office so he could finish what he started. I forwarded the email to Noelle Tanis before I even blinked. She had been on standby since the license was approved, a corporate lawyer with a sharp reputation and an even sharper memory. I found her through Rachel in compliance, an off-the-record recommendation that had been quietly delivered over an almond snack and a glance that said, "You'll need someone soon." Noelle was the type of woman who didn't raise her voice in court because she didn't need to. She was surgical in tone and terrifying in calm. Her reply came just 8 minutes later. Received. Drafting formal notice. Do not respond to internal messages. All communication now goes through me. By the time I left the office that night, the air outside felt thick with clarity. I didn't walk like a secretary anymore. I walked like someone who understood power, not the kind that sat at the top of the building in leather chairs, but the kind that lived in paper trails, digital footprints, and the precise limits of policy. I went home, drank water, slept deeply. The next day would bring the real test. I arrived at the office at 8:01 a.m. My computer refused to let me log in. No error message, just a flashing prompt. Access denied. Account disabled. My email? Locked. My calendar? Blank. Even my building pass buzzed red when I entered the executive floor. It took the receptionist buzzing me in manually to get through. They weren't subtle. That was the point. At 8:25, my phone vibrated. Text message from HR. Please report to room 3A immediately. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I had already prepared the envelope. Room 3A was the office's version of an interrogation cell: gray walls, fluorescent lights that hummed like insects, and a rectangular table that always felt slightly too long. Lyle Tompkins was already seated when I arrived, flanked by two men in dark suits who didn't introduce themselves. Probably internal legal, though neither had the confidence of outside counsel. Ms. Sanderson, Lyle said, nodding once. His hands rested on a thick manila folder, with my name labeled in bold. Thank you for coming. I took my seat slowly. My bag stayed zipped. I let the silence hang. We're reviewing your recent actions surrounding the proprietary contract files associated with the biotech acquisition, one of the lawyers said. It appears you've submitted documentation to an external body without prior authorization. They wanted me to panic. I didn't. Instead, I reached into my bag and withdrew a single envelope, heavy, sealed, with Noel's insignia embossed on the flap. I slid it forward across the table. This is an official communication from my legal counsel, I said evenly. I won't be responding to internal questioning. All inquiries can be directed to her office from this point forward. Lyle blinked. The lawyer hesitated. That's premature, he said. No, I said. It's prudent. You've disabled my system access, locked my credentials, and initiated a formal investigation based on a legal filing I made within the rights granted under corporate policy. We're not suggesting criminal conduct, Lyle interjected quickly. Just internal policy violations. I acted within a documented, approved clause of the licensing framework that your legal team signed off on, I replied calmly. If that's now considered a violation, you'll need to explain why your compliance department didn't flag the clause years ago. The lawyer opened the envelope and began reading. His lips moved slightly as his eyes scanned the lines. In addition, I said, any further attempts to restrict my employment, damage my professional reputation, or create a hostile work environment will be considered retaliatory in nature and handled accordingly. Lyle's jaw tightened. You've placed this company in a very uncomfortable position, Sandy. You mean Pedro's in an uncomfortable position, I corrected. The company's just cleaning up after him. Neither of them replied. I stood. I've done nothing wrong, I said softly, and we both know that. Then I left. By lunchtime, Noel had followed up with a second message, a letter to the board. Direct, meticulous, and unequivocal in its language. Any further repressive actions taken against Ms. Sanderson, including but not limited to system lockouts, professional isolation, or baseless investigatory procedures, will result in immediate legal response, including filings for whistleblower retaliation, breach of labor law, and damages. She has acted entirely within her rights. She has documented every step. She is not afraid of being seen. I didn't see Pedro that day, but I saw Jackson pacing in the hallway, eyes darting, tie loosened. I saw Arthur in legal with sweat rings under his arms. I saw Rachel glance at me with something new in her expression. Respect. That afternoon, as I sat at my desk, now working from a personal device connected to a private hotspot, I opened a blank document and began making a list. Phase 2. Because the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. By Thursday, the storm had officially changed direction. It wasn't just whispers anymore. It was looks, pauses, conversations that ended the moment I walked into a room. For once, the tension in the office wasn't radiating toward me. It was circling higher. Over the corner office. Over Pedro. People weren't asking what I had done. They were asking what he had let happen. That morning, I overheard a conversation near the elevators. Two mid-level execs from finance whispering under their breath. Harold's not going to ignore this. Not after the legal risk. Not after the license transfer. This is exposure. They didn't know I was behind them until I stepped in. One of them flushed. The other looked down and cleared his throat. Neither said hello. I didn't blame them. Fear works quickly in corporate settings. But uncertainty? It spreads like smoke. And I had lit the match. My desk was untouched, but I could feel the change every time I moved through the floor. No more awkward glances. No more head tilts. I was being watched now, but not with suspicion, with calculation. The kind that makes people reevaluate everything they thought they knew about someone. At 3:46 p.m., the message came through. Not from Pedro. Not from HR. From the office of Harold Wexley, the chairman of the board. Ms. Sanderson, the chairman requests a private meeting at your earliest availability. 4:30 p.m. Room 9F. Please refrain from discussing this invitation. Discretion is appreciated. Wexley Executive Office. I read it twice. Harold Wexley had never spoken to me. I had seen him maybe 3 times in 8 years. Tall, silver hair, always flanked by 2 aides, speaking in short phrases that stopped conversations cold. He was part legend, part ghost, the kind of man who didn't waste time on lower floors unless something big had broken loose. I knew then. He wasn't reaching out because he was curious. He already knew what had happened. He just wanted to know how dangerous I really was. At 4:25, I straightened my jacket, slid a folder into my bag, and walked toward the north wing, where the glass-walled offices sat untouched, like they belonged to another world. Room 9F wasn't on any of the internal maps. It was the kind of meeting room you only learned about if someone like Harold told you it existed. I knocked once. "Come in!" His voice was low, practiced, a voice that didn't need to rise to command respect. I stepped inside. The room was cool and quiet. No windows. A long black table. A single chair waiting across from him. Harold sat with a legal pad, a tablet, and a cup of untouched tea. He didn't stand when I entered, but he did look up, clearly, directly. "Sandy," he said, "have a seat." He didn't offer pleasantries, didn't ask how I was, just folded his hands and waited. "I've heard a lot of things this week," he began. "Some from Pedro, some from internal legal, some, unfortunately, from outside this company, but none from you." I nodded once. "That's by design." "Then let's change that." He leaned forward slightly. "I'd like you to explain what happened, from the beginning, and I'd like you to be very clear." So I told him. I didn't hedge. I didn't embellish. I laid it all out with the kind of precision only a secretary would use. Every date, every clause, every time-stamped detail. I explained how I prepared the documents, how I noticed the clause, how I flagged the issue to Pedro in that boardroom. I described the moment he laughed, how he dismissed me in front of everyone. I explained how I went home that night and researched the clause, confirmed its legitimacy, and legally filed the paperwork to acquire the dormant license. I detailed the symbolic dollar, the notary visit, the confirmation email from the registrar. I included the retaliation, system access shut off, HR meetings, intimidation tactics. And finally, I recounted Pedro's attempt to bribe me into surrendering the asset. I said it all without emotion, not because I wasn't angry, but because I knew that in this room, emotion wasn't power. Documentation was. Harold didn't interrupt once. He wrote occasionally, small notes, short lines. His face gave nothing away. When I finished, I sat back in silence. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "I read your lawyer's filings," he said. "Very precise." "She's good," I said. "She is." He tapped his pen once against the table. I'm going to ask you something, off record. I nodded. Are you planning to go to the press? No, I said. Not yet. Why not? Because I don't need to, I replied. Right now, this company needs to decide what it's going to be, and whether it protects its systems or just its egos. He seemed to consider that. I understand your position, he said finally, and I want you to know, this has my full attention. I will be reviewing everything, personally. I believed him. Men like Harold don't waste words. He leaned back slightly, folding his hands again. But I am going to ask you, very directly, not to speak to the press until I've had time to assess what we're dealing with. I held his gaze. Is that a request or a warning? Neither, he said. It's a promise. If you give me your silence, I'll give you my scrutiny. And that means everything Pedro's touched, from the contract to the boardroom, will be under review. I paused, then nodded. Then I'll wait. He gave the smallest nod of approval, more gesture than emotion. And Sandy, he added, as I stood to leave. What you did? That wasn't luck. That was leverage. Don't waste it. I won't. As I stepped out of room 9F, the hallway felt colder, quieter. I didn't know what Harold would do, but I knew this much. I had told the truth, in the language of power, and now the rules were no longer his. They were mine. The summons came early Monday morning. It wasn't an email. It was a printed letter, formal, heavy cream stock, sealed in an envelope marked confidential, and delivered to my desk by Harold Wexley's assistant herself. She didn't say a word, just placed it gently on my keyboard and gave the smallest of nods before walking away. Inside, the letter was direct. You are requested to attend a closed session of the Board of Directors at 10 a.m., Room 1A. This is an official matter. Be prepared to speak clearly on the events referenced in prior communications and to answer questions as necessary. Wexley, Chairman. I folded the letter, placed it in my notebook, and took a deep breath. This was it. This wasn't backdoor HR manipulation. This wasn't whispered rumors in a hallway. This was a seat at the real table, the place where reputations are made or shredded in real time. At 9:58, I walked into room 1A. It was a long, elegant boardroom, lined with dark walnut panels and a 12-seat conference table that looked as if it had been carved from authority itself. The board members were already seated, flipping through their printed packets. Elaine Dawes was there, lips tight, fingers drumming. 2 partners from legal, CFO Nguyen, and Harold Wexley at the head of the table, reading silently but clearly aware of everything in the room. Pedro sat 2 seats down, hunched slightly in his chair. No suit jacket, no espresso, just a man in slow-motion damage control. For the first time, he looked small in a room where he used to dominate. Harold didn't waste time. We'll begin, he said. This meeting is now officially in session. Ms. Sanderson, please state your role and the nature of your involvement in the matter under discussion. I stood. My name is Sandy Sanderson, I began calmly. I've worked at Elleron Holdings for 8 years in a support and administrative capacity. 3 weeks ago, while assisting in the documentation of a pending acquisition, I identified a legally actionable clause, 9.3c, which enabled dormant license transfers. I took a breath. After pointing out this clause to Mr. Beltran and being publicly dismissed, I independently verified its validity and, acting as a private citizen, not in my professional capacity, submitted a legal request to assume rights to a dormant license asset through the appropriate registrar. All actions were conducted outside of work hours, through non-company resources, and in accordance with state and corporate regulations. There was silence. Pens moved. Pages flipped. Then Harold looked at Pedro. Mr. Beltran, did you receive a warning regarding this clause prior to the filing? Pedro's jaw clenched. I was made aware of a comment from Ms. Sanderson during a meeting, he said finally. She expressed concern about contract language. I considered it irrelevant at the time. You dismissed the warning? Harold asked sharply. Pedro's gaze darted across the table. It didn't seem material. She's not a legal expert. I made a judgment call. And that judgment call resulted in the loss of a licensed asset now critical to a pending $70 million acquisition, said Elaine flatly. Pedro swallowed. I couldn't have anticipated. You didn't check, Pedro, Harold said coldly. That's the point. A board member from legal cleared his throat. Ms. Sanderson, he said, turning to me, you did not access or manipulate any protected information not already available through official documentation? No, sir, I replied. Everything I used was standard within the contract and public-facing registrar systems. Nothing was confidential. And you submitted the license request through your own entity? Yes. Another pause. Then Harold leaned forward. We've also reviewed the follow-up actions taken by Mr. Beltran following the license transfer. The attempt to silence Ms. Sanderson through internal investigation, the disabling of her access, and the undocumented offer of funds in exchange for relinquishing the asset. He trailed off. But the silence finished the sentence for him. Elaine spoke next. There's a difference between protecting corporate interest and punishing an employee for outmaneuvering you. Pedro didn't respond. He didn't even try. Harold turned to legal. We have what we need? Yes, they said. The documentation is complete, verified. The chain of events is clear. Then Harold turned back to Pedro, and his tone shifted, not with anger, but with authority, the kind that ends discussions before they begin. As of this meeting, you are removed from active duty. Effective immediately, your access to company systems, communications, and physical premises is revoked pending a full governance review. Pedro's face went pale. You can't be serious. Harold raised a hand, and the room went still. This company doesn't belong to you, Pedro, and it certainly won't be dragged down by your negligence. Two security officers, plain-clothed and quiet, stepped just inside the door. A message, a boundary. Pedro stood slowly. His voice was almost pleading now. You're going to let her ruin me over one technicality? I met his eyes. No, Pedro, I said. You did that all by yourself. He didn't reply. He just turned and walked out of the room, flanked by silence. When the door clicked shut, Harold looked back at me. We'll be in touch, he said. You'll be protected. I'm not afraid, I replied. Good. He nodded once more. And just like that, the meeting ended. But the game had changed. And I wasn't a secretary anymore. 2 days after the board meeting, the official memo went out. Pedro Beltran had resigned. No warning, no drawn-out transition, no dramatic farewell speech to the company. Just a cold, short internal announcement that hit inboxes at 9:02 a.m., signed by Harold Wexley himself. Effective immediately, Pedro Beltran has stepped down as Chief Executive Officer of Aileron Holdings. We thank him for his years of service and leadership and wish him well in his future endeavors. That was it. No tribute, no portrait in the newsletter, not even a line about the acquisition project he had once bragged would define his legacy. In the space of a week, Pedro had gone from untouchable to irrelevant. It didn't feel like revenge, it felt like correction. Like the company had quietly acknowledged it was time to purge something toxic and start breathing again. By noon, whispers about his replacement had already started circulating. The frontrunner was Garaj Patel, our senior strategy officer. He had always flown just under the radar, steady, analytical, polite, but never showy. I'd seen him exactly 3 times in the last year, usually in passing or during quick pre-meeting handovers when I helped prep logistics. He wasn't flashy like Pedro. He didn't treat meetings like stages. But people respected him. He didn't play power games. He played long games, quiet ones. That afternoon, a private calendar invite appeared in my inbox. Subject: Brief one-on-one. Garaj Patel, location: Executive Office 3C. Time: 4:15 p.m. The note had no details, just a location and a time. When I walked into the office, Garage stood up to greet me. His presence was nothing like Pedro's. He didn't radiate intimidation. He radiated precision, measured movements, composed energy, eyes that made you feel like everything you said would be remembered. "Thank you for coming, Sandy," he said. "Of course," I replied cautiously. He gestured for me to sit. "Let me get straight to it," he began. "The acquisition deal is back on track. The buyer was alarmed by the recent disruption, but they've agreed to re-enter negotiations under new leadership." "That's good to hear." "It is. And that's why I asked you here." He paused briefly. "You saw what others didn't. You acted, quietly, effectively, and within your rights. And frankly, you forced this company to face something it's been ignoring for years, the cracks in our own arrogance. I didn't know what to say to that." He smiled just a little. "I'd like you to join the negotiations advisory team, not as a secretary, not as a paper pusher, as a compliance and risk advisor, an internal consultant with full authority to audit every line of the deal." I blinked. "You want me in the room?" "I want you at the table," he said. "But there's more. If you accept, you'll need a few things: access to historical contracts, unrestricted viewing of board archives related to the deal, and authority to speak directly to any department or executive involved. No middle channels, no bureaucracy." It was a lot. But I had learned not to look surprised. Not anymore. "I'll need it in writing," I said carefully. "You'll have it before the end of the day," he replied without hesitation. "I'll also want indemnity protection for any findings I report," I added. "Done. And permission to bring in one external compliance advisor of my choosing." "That too." He leaned back. "You're not here because of politics, Sandy. You're here because we can't afford another blind spot." I nodded once. "Then I'm in." Within 48 hours, I was given temporary clearance credentials and a corner workstation in the executive wing. No one called it a promotion, and I didn't care for titles. But everything was different. Doors opened. People who once brushed past me in hallways now paused, offered coffee, asked questions. I had access to every single draft of the acquisition agreement, internal memos between departments, negotiation notes from the buyer's counsel, things I used to print and staple without reading. And now I read everything. The deal was complex. Cross-border clauses, intellectual property licenses, shared data protocols, third-party patents buried in old partner contracts. A nightmare waiting to happen if not handled correctly. But I wasn't afraid of complexity. I had lived in its margins for 8 years. I flagged 3 minor discrepancies in the new draft within the first day. One had the potential to delay product rights in the EU by 6 months. The second could have triggered a dormant liability with a former biotech partner. The third, small but telling, was a duplicated clause that would have allowed the buyer to quietly renegotiate downstream tech rights without notice. Each time, I annotated the issue, explained the risk, and emailed it with a calm note. See Section 4.2b, Recommend Revision. Language here opens a potential contractual ambiguity. The response from legal? Immediate. "Good catch. Thanks, Sandy." Adjusting now. Garage never micromanaged. He simply checked in every evening, sometimes just with a 2-word message. "All clear?" And when I said yes, he trusted that it was. Within 3 weeks, the deal was finalized. Transparently, efficiently, and with every clause double-checked under a new standard of scrutiny. Industry analysts noticed. One tech publication called it a model example of post-crisis negotiation resilience. Another noted the unexpected emergence of governance reforms at Aileron Holdings, citing the newly established role of internal risk advisors and Sandy Sanderson by name. That part startled me. I hadn't given an interview, but someone, somewhere, had leaked just enough of the truth to shift the narrative. Not whistleblower, not secretary, advisor, professional, necessary. I didn't celebrate. Not in the way people expected. I didn't buy anything extravagant. I didn't go out. I simply stayed late one evening, sitting alone in the now quiet executive floor, staring out the tall windows at the city below. There had been moments, so many, when I thought I would break. When I thought the pressure, the retaliation, the weight of doing the right thing would crush me. But it hadn't. Because I had something they never saw coming. Not just knowledge, conviction, and the willingness to act on it, even when no one believed I could. The deal had closed 2 days ago, but the impact was still settling like dust after a demolition. The office was quieter than usual, not the uncomfortable silence of tension, but the kind that follows something big, something irreversible. There was a calm in the hallways now, a weight that had lifted. Pedro was gone. Officially, permanently, quietly. And in his place, Garage had begun to rebuild, not with loud speeches or bold memos, but with quiet corrections, private restructurings, and intentional decisions. One of those decisions, I soon learned, had everything to do with me. That morning, a simple message popped up in my inbox. Sandy, 5 p.m., my office. G. No subject line, no details. But I knew. I could feel it before I even stepped into the room. I spent the rest of the day in meetings and follow-ups, finalizing internal reviews of the acquisition, consulting with compliance, and preparing feedback for the new legal formatting templates I'd suggested. People looked at me differently now, not like I had risen up the ranks, but like I had peeled back the curtain on something they had always sensed but never dared to address. The truth was simple. I had forced the company to look at itself, and the mirror hadn't been kind. At 4:58, I walked quietly down the executive corridor. This time, no one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. That was the difference now. No one questioned whether I belonged. When I stepped into Garage's office, he was at his desk, reviewing something on a tablet. He looked up, nodded once, and gestured to the chair across from him. Thanks for coming. I sat down without speaking. I won't waste time, he said. We've had a lot of noise the last few weeks, and your name's come up in every room where strategy's being discussed. I hope in a good way, I said carefully. He smiled. Only in the best ways. He set the tablet down and leaned forward slightly. We need to make some structural changes, Sandy. Real ones. Not just shuffling people around or rebranding departments. We need a system that actually identifies risk before it costs us $70 million. Or a CEO. I nodded. Agreed. So here's what I want to do, he continued. I want to create a new division, small, focused, agile. A team that works across departments to examine high-stakes contracts, emerging deals, and internal policy blind spots. He paused, locking eyes with me. I want you to lead it. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I want to name you Director of Risk and Contract Strategy. You'd report directly to the board. You'd have unrestricted visibility into all contract pipelines. You'd speak freely to legal, compliance, finance, without needing approval or layers of clearance. I said nothing. You wouldn't just be advising, he added. You'd be influencing. You'd have the authority to stop a deal cold if you found something questionable. Full independence. No filters. I studied him for a long moment. Why me? I asked. He smiled. Because you saw what none of us did, and because you didn't flinch when the system pushed back. I looked away for a second, grounding myself. I thought about Pedro. I thought about that boardroom and the HR meeting and the laugh I would never forget. I thought about the version of myself who had once printed contracts and sorted catering, who had gone home late at night wondering if she would ever be anything more than invisible. Then I looked back at Garage. You're serious about this? I asked. As serious as I was when I backed your authority during the deal, he said. And what makes you think the board will go for it? They already have, he replied. This was a formality. I blinked. He continued. You're already operating at that level, Sandy. This just gives it a name and a seat. There was silence. But this time, it wasn't awkward. It was filled with something heavier: recognition. He wasn't offering me a favor, he was offering me a place, a real one. I nodded once. Okay, I'll accept the role. He exhaled, like a weight had lifted. Good. Legal will send over your contract and advisory rights. Your office will be moved near the board suite. You'll need to choose 1 or 2 team members to start building with. Keep it small for now. I smiled. I already have a few names in mind. He stood and extended a hand. I shook it, firm and calm. But before I turned to leave, I paused. Garage? He looked up. This isn't a victory for me because of the title, I said quietly. I know. It's a victory because people listen now, because my voice means something. He nodded. And we're better off because of it. That evening, I didn't celebrate. Not in the way others might. I didn't go out to dinner or buy a new bag or post a cryptic status online. I went home, I made a cup of tea. I sat at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and pulled up a blank document titled Risk Watch, Volume 1. Internal Blind Spots. It was time to start building. But more than that, it was time to start changing, because no one was going to speak over me again. And now, I had the power, and the position, to make sure no one else was silenced either. I arrived early. The sky outside was still gray, the kind of filtered morning light that cast long, gentle shadows across the polished floors of the executive wing. My heels clicked softly, no longer hesitant, no longer trying to blend in. I walked with intention now, not urgency. There was no ceremony, no balloons, no HR photo op. Just a keycard that worked, a door that opened without resistance, and a glass nameplate on the wall beside it. S. Sanderson, Director, Risk and Contract Strategy. I stood there for a moment before unlocking the door. The office wasn't large, not in the way Pedro's had been. There was no private espresso bar, no velvet chairs meant to intimidate. Just clean lines, natural light, a simple oak desk, and 2 visitor chairs across from mine. But to me, it was everything. It was proof. Not that I had survived, but that I had changed the rules. I stepped inside, slid my laptop bag off my shoulder, and placed it gently on the desk. Then I pulled out the only thing that mattered to me today: a weathered notebook with a cracked spine and curled corners. I'd carried it through every phase of this journey: secret meetings, after-hours discoveries, gut-sick mornings in HR. It held my thoughts, my anger, my questions, and my resolve. I flipped to the back page and wrote deliberately, "This office isn't a throne, it's a promise. No one should have to scream just to be believed. No one should have to fight alone just to be heard." I capped my pen, sat back. This moment wasn't about the title. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about Pedro anymore. It was about the fact that I had once been no one, and now no one could pretend I didn't matter. People started arriving by 9 a.m. I could hear the soft murmur of early meetings, the sound of hallway greetings, the occasional laugh from someone whose job was made easier because the deal had gone through clean. I checked my calendar. It was full: board debriefings, contract risk assessments, the first of many one-on-ones with department heads who now wanted my input. Wanted, not tolerated. At 9:15, Rachel from compliance walked in holding a modest potted plant, something green and spiky in a minimalist ceramic pot. "I thought your new office could use some personality," she said, smiling. "Thanks," I said, and I meant it. She placed it near the window, stepped back, then looked at me with something unreadable in her eyes. Something close to gratitude. "You made us feel like we weren't crazy," she said after a pause. "All those years, noticing things, but never saying them out loud. You did." I nodded. "Now it's everyone's turn." She gave a small laugh. "God help the next guy who tries to get cute with contract language." "God help him," I agreed. Throughout the day, people dropped by, some with congratulations, others with quiet curiosity. A few still looked at me like I was something unpredictable, dangerous even. But I didn't shrink under their eyes. Let them wonder. Let them learn that power doesn't always look like the loudest person in the room. By late afternoon, I was alone again. I opened the first official contract for review under my new title. The language was clean, sharp, and well-structured. Almost too perfect. I knew the team was trying to impress me, or maybe hoping I'd rubber stamp it. I smiled. They didn't know me very well yet. I started marking. Page by page, I read between the lines, highlighted inconsistencies, flagged one clause that referenced outdated regulatory terms. By the time I finished, I had 5 annotations, 2 follow-up questions, and 1 suggested rewrite. I sent it back with a brief message. Well done overall. But we don't lower our standards just because it's cleaner than the last mess. No exclamation point. No emoji. Just the truth. I closed the laptop. As evening approached, I sat by the window with a mug of tea and looked out over the city. 8 years ago, I'd started here with fresh notebooks and no expectations. I'd made everyone's schedules work, kept the copier running, remembered who liked almond milk and who couldn't eat gluten. I was invisible, but necessary. Until the moment I wasn't invisible anymore. I'd been thinking a lot about Pedro, not in the way people might expect. I didn't care what happened to him, whether he started a consulting firm or went into hiding, whether he blamed me or wrote a self-pitying memoir. He was just a shadow that had passed through the company. What mattered wasn't his fall. What mattered was what replaced him. Garage had started something new, not just with me, but with the culture. There was more listening now, more second glances at documents, more curiosity from people who used to nod through meetings because they didn't want to seem difficult. It wasn't perfect, it never would be. But something had shifted, something real, and I had helped turn the wheel. The next morning, I printed a single-page memo and posted it on the internal portal under our new division. Subject: Risk and Contract Strategy, Open Door Policy. To all staff, regardless of department or level. If you notice something in a contract, a process, or a pattern that feels off, even if you're not qualified to analyze it, this office is open to you. No gatekeepers, no bureaucracy. If it's worth worrying about, it's worth reviewing. You don't need permission to care about doing things right. S. Sanderson. That was the first true order of business, and it was more important than any clause I'd ever redlined. That Friday, I stayed late. Not out of duty, out of peace. I took one last walk through the floor I used to work on. It felt strange now, like visiting the house you grew up in after it had been sold to someone else. The desks were the same, the lighting, even the smell. But everything had changed. Because I had changed. And more importantly, because I had refused to leave quietly. No screaming, no sabotage. Just one woman, one warning, one loophole, and $1. That had been enough. Enough to stop a deal. Enough to reveal a truth. Enough to demand something better. It turned out I hadn't needed to start a war. I just needed to stop saying yes to silence. And now they could hear me loud and clear.